Hey, welcome to BJJ Mental Models, Episode 5. This is Steve Kwan.
I'm Matt Kwan.
And today, continuing the trend of talking about the mechanical models of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, we are going to talk about finishing mechanics. So, Matt, this is probably going to be something that you're most fluent with. I know that this is terminology that you guys use at Island Top Team. Particularly, you divide this into two general families. You've got breaking mechanics for joint locks and choking mechanics for chokes.
That's right. Yeah. So it's really important to distinguish these different types of mechanics when we're essentially looking to finish submissions. Let's start with breaking mechanics. So breaking mechanics meaning, the overall goal is to break a part of your opponent's body, right? Breaking mechanics can be linear, or they can be rotational, or they can be both sometimes, right? So an arm bar would obviously be like a hyperextension. So that's a linear joint lock. And then there's going to be a rotational joint lock, such as a Kimura. And then in certain cases, you're going to mix the two. So maybe you're doing a knee bar that has a little bit of a twist on it, or maybe you're doing a arm bar where you're controlling the wrist and you're torquing the wrist in a certain way, depending on what you're trying to achieve. If you can talk about these two different ideas of break it down into joint locks and chokes, you're going to have a little bit more of an understanding of some of the finishing details.
Got it. So up until this point, everything we've talked about, whether it be alignments or the core mechanics of jiu-jitsu, everything we've talked about really talks about positional control and how to establish proper positional dominance. What we're talking about now is the last step. So you've completely broken your opponent's alignment. You have full control over them. It's time to apply a submission. Submissions generally fall into these two categories. Now, there are weird, exotic, like compression chokes you can do that attack like the lungs and stuff. But generally speaking, high percentage submissions come down to blood chokes or joint locks on the arms of the legs. Now, everyone knows different ways to do these different submissions, but maybe what we can talk about is, this being a mental models podcast, what are some of the commonalities between them, Matt? So if we're talking about like chokes, for example, what are some of the things that all chokes have in common that people should be aware of?
Well, when you're choking someone, there's several different ways to finish chokes. They can generally attack the arteries, in which case your opponent is going to be rendered unconscious. Or you could, essentially combine a breaking, choking mechanic like a neck crank or a jaw crush, which is not necessarily going to make your opponent unconscious, but it will result in damage to their skeleton. And you can also apply chokes to their trachea, to their windpipe, which in my experience is pretty impossible to not tap to, just because it is so painful and you will die.
I'm glad you brought this up, because when I was coming up in jiu-jitsu, I was always told, you got to make it a blood choke. You got to, if you're doing a choke, you got to make sure it's a blood choke. If you're doing an air pipe choke, you're doing it wrong. In fact, I remember back when I started training, this was such a taboo that I remember one time I got a choke on someone, and then afterwards he kind of like said, that was an air choke, as if it like wasn't legit that he submitted because of it. Yeah. And this is kind of one of those common weird jiu-jitsu dogma things that it's got to be a blood choke if it's going to be a legitimate choke. From my experience as well, air chokes are every bit as legitimate as blood chokes for a variety of reasons, but one of them being that if you really do choke someone's trachea properly, you're probably going to stimulate the gag reflex. That's going to cause a rush of blood to the head, which is going to have effectively the same effect as a blood choke. Like I am pretty sure that I could choke someone unconscious with like an air choke guillotine if I needed to. I do not believe that those are inherently any weaker than blood chokes. Matt, where do you come down on this?
I mean, I totally agree in terms of their effectiveness. I think that, and I've heard that too, like, oh, well, that was an air choke. That wasn't as clean. You're right about that. It's not clean, right? If your training partner is someone that we don't want to hurt our training partners, so we might strive to get the cleanest, most quote unquote pain-free chokes as possible. But when it comes down to it, we're practicing a martial art where we are trying to incapacitate our opponent. So there's really nothing dirty or wrong about an air choke. Now, if you're gonna neck crank your training partner, or jaw crush your training partner, I mean, you know, I like to think that I have a school that fosters this being, if you're going to do something like this, that it's applied safely and that there's an understanding that we are going to tap if there's danger. But I don't think it's as tasteful. Now, in terms of a jaw crush, you know, there's really, if I can get my arm over a training partner's head, I'm going to slowly apply that jaw crush, because I think that is, that's fair. I think that's fair enough that it is obviously effective. There's no denying that eventually you can break someone's jaw. In terms of a neck crank, I generally steer clear of neck cranks just because necks are so valuable to us. And for longevity reasons, I don't want to hurt my training partners. But that being said, in a tournament, if it's allowed, I will totally neck crank someone, and I will totally twister someone in training as well. So as long as things are applied safely and respectfully, there shouldn't be an issue with these types of finishes. And as long as they're effective and they get a tap, that's really what we're going for here.
Yeah, I think the takeaway there is, if it is a controlled submission where the guy doing it is gently applying pressure in a friendly way, as crazy as that sounds, but you know the difference when you feel it, right? Like, I can have you in an air choke, and I can be applying it in a friendly way, where it's like, look, you and I both know that we're training here. Yeah, it's an air choke, but there is that friendly factor to it. That's different from the guy who is, like, you know, trying to, like, jaw crush you just because he's got to get that win during the training session. And I would also add that, so yeah, to elaborate on that thought, if you're training with someone, you need to look up for your partner's longevity. That is super duper important. Stuff like neck cranks, for example. I'm not denying the effectiveness of these techniques, but they really don't have much place in training. You know, if you want to practice that stuff, do it with a willing partner who knows you're doing it, and do it in a catch and release fashion rather than really applying pressure. The neck is not something that you want to mess around with. You've got to be wary that certain types of attacks can damage your opponent in ways that can last for the rest of their lives. And if you're going to use those kind of techniques, it needs to be consensual and it needs to be safe, right? You don't want to be doing something like that on someone who isn't expecting it, doesn't even know it's a submission, isn't aware of the long-term damage. So just be cognizant of that. I would also add on top of this that, you know, in training, there is no shame to tapping from pressure or tapping from unpleasantness. Sometimes this is a good idea. In competition, that's probably a different story. Or in a real fight, that would be a different story. But in training, you know, if someone is really, really hell-bent on shoulder crushing me, and, you know, I don't want to go into work the next day with, like, gi burns all over my face, I will absolutely tap from pressure like that. And I will use that as a learning experience to make sure that in the future, I just never get into such a situation. I think that the mentality of, surviving at all costs and toughing it out, when you're training, really you're better off focusing on learning and on learning how to avoid these situations in the first place, rather than trying to, you know, just spaz out of these bad positions and possibly causing long-term damage to yourself.
Right. And when we talk about chokes, there's a few things that kind of fall in line with pretty much all different types of chokes. So one rule that I like to use when I'm teaching chokes is you basically want to get everything in position before you apply the actual horsepower portion of the submission. So, you know, whatever choke I have, let's say I'm going for a head and arm choke, and as soon as I isolate your head and arm, I start squeezing right away and I start going for the finish right away. When you do this, you deny yourself the ability to essentially get the proper angle and all the little details that you want to get. I call them the minor finishing details. And then there's the major finishing details, which would be the you're starting to squeeze now. That's the last step you do. Mm-hmm. The minor finishing details is getting everything into place. Your digging mechanics, if you're talking about leg locks, which we'll get into later. If you start squeezing too early, you can never go back and make the adjustments necessary to making that submission a lot more efficient. So it's really important that you don't rush through your finishes. You always want to set up your chokes in such a way that not only do you, when you get in your position, you want to make sure that you deny your opponent the ability to escape. How do you do that? Most of the time, it's going to be by breaking their alignment. So if it's a head and arm, I want to deny them the ability of getting their arm free of the head and arm submission. Ideally, I would like to have them pinned in such a way that they can't use their posture to escape and their head is in a box, because I'm doing such a good job of keeping my head connected to theirs. My grips are tight, and I spent the time needed pushing the arm into the proper position, and I have the correct placement. If I decide I want to rush through something and just use pure strength, as most practitioners know, that is not the most efficient way to do things.
Yeah, from my experience too, when you try to do that, first of all, you stand a good chance of not getting the submission. I mean, the perfect example is the arm triangle. It is possible to try to just like squeeze the life out of a guy with an arm triangle before you've done it perfectly. But from my experience, first of all, it reduces your chance of successfully completing the finish. And second of all, you run the risk then of gassing yourself out, right? If you squeeze so hard that you basically can no longer use your arms, when your opponent gets out of that arm triangle, now you're in a big world of hurt, right? So that's the kind of situation that you want to avoid. Tying on to your concept, your discussion earlier about alignment, the thing that I always think with submissions is I highly encourage that you don't think of positions and submissions as two separate things. They're really the same. All a submission is it is a particular type of position where your opponent's posture and structure are so compromised that they basically have to give up the fight. That's all it is, right? If you try and like dive onto submissions, you're missing the opportunity to further break down your opponent's posture and structure. And this is a very subtle thing, but it's actually a very key difference. Guys who are good at jiu-jitsu, they don't think, I'm going for the submission now. I'm going for the submission now. What they think is, I'm going to take away a bit of your structure, posture, or base, and then I'm going to do it again, and then I'm going to do it again, and I'm going to keep doing it like a boa constrictor until eventually it just so happens that you have to tap out. That's the way I think of things, right? Like when I'm advancing position or trying to isolate a limb and secure a submission, it's not about submitting the guy. It's about just progressively breaking his alignment a little bit more until his alignment is broken to the point where it's actually damaging to him. And at this point now, he has to give up the fight.
Yeah, and we've been speaking right now in terms of like no gi submission, so like a head and arm, right? Well, what if it's a gi submission? We're obviously going to be, let's take the bow and arrow for example. Of course, that's going to be, you're going to be driving the bus with a grip wrapped around your opponent's opposite side collar, right? And then let's say you get into that situation and before you've gotten under the chin, but you don't really have everything tight where it needs to be, and you just start pulling on that collar, good chance if you don't have rotational control of your opponent, they're going to spin out, right? Or they're going to get their head free because you didn't take the time to break their alignment and actually set up control. So whatever type of submission we're trying to apply, whether it's a joint lock or a choke, we want to be able to have control that leads to submission, right? And more specifically, breaking alignment, causing control that leads to submission. So if I have you in a head and arm and it doesn't work and you escape, I want to have backup plans that maintain a strong position. I don't want to have a game where I'm trying to catch submissions, and if I don't get that submission, it's an all or nothing thing, and now my opponent has scrambled out and is possibly going to my back. That would be the wrong thing to do.
Yeah, you want to avoid what I think of as submission tunnel vision, where it's like I see the possibility of an armbar, and one way or another, I'm going to get this armbar. And you're so focused on trying to lock up the armbar that you're ignoring opportunities to further break alignment, or you're ignoring opportunities to get other perfectly good submissions that are right there, right? This is a very common mistake that people make right up to the high levels where they get, and I catch myself making this mistake all the time, where like a horse with blinders, I'm so focused on getting a particular submission that I'm giving up the opportunity to advance position and break alignment along the way, or even finish the fight in an equally effective form.
Yeah, and I have guys that come to me, they say, oh, I want to get a better rear naked choke. Whenever I go for the rear naked choke, like I can't finish. I'm thinking,
like, who cares? As long as you can advance the position, who cares, right?
This is true, but I also say, okay, show me what you're doing. They take the seatbelt and then they break their own seatbelt, and then the one arm tries to strangle me. Mm-hmm. So the issue with this is that they're not focusing on rotational control by way of a lever. So one of my favorite ways to set up a rear naked choke is I take control of the arm with the motorcycle grip. So now I've accessed control of my opponent's arm. I know that they're not going to be able to turn in a particular way. Now I can use my other free arm to either help me trap their remaining arm or go for my choke right away. I can also incorporate one of my legs in a crucifix type back control position so that I've taken out both of their arms of the equation. So rather than just trying to catch a rear naked choke, I'm applying it with control. I'm trying to get rotational control by isolating levers. And this is essentially cornering my opponent into a situation where the control is so great that they can't spin out. It's also very important to think about, like I mentioned with the arm triangle, and of course with the rear naked choke is no exception, that we want to have wedges around our opponent's head. Whenever we're trying to control someone and choke them, when I say break their alignment, I mean like really break their posture in such a way that bridging escaping is not going to be available. They can't get their back to the mat because your head is blocking them. And there's always an obstruction that prevents their head and their spinal column from escaping to the side that they want. So this is a very important way to think about controlling someone, because this will give us way better control when we look for submissions, when normally, if we're not considering these things, they might just spin out and then we are stuck on the bottom.
Yeah, this is actually a great example. The rear naked choke specifically is a great example of why alignment and positional control are so important when you're trying to apply a submission. So many people, when they see someone's back, they get real excited. I have this happen a lot where, if I'm playing turtle, especially people who are less experienced, they get real excited because they think there's the guy's back. I can get a rear naked choke, and they'll dive on you, right? And submission diving is always a bad idea because it means that you're trying to get a submission without securing the position. And without having proper alignment and without breaking your opponent's alignment. So a lot of the time, someone will try and jump on my back and throw on a rear naked choke. They don't have their hooks. They don't have proper chest to back control on me, and there's no threat at all. So I get out. I get out. It's not a problem. Whereas what's much more intimidating is someone who takes the time to properly secure the back position, defeat my arms, control my legs, and then ultimately, if I cannot use my arms and legs, it's only a matter of time before I'm going to get choked. Right? That's a far more way to threaten me, a far greater way to threaten me than to just try to jump on my back and hope that you get to choke.
Yeah, I like the term you use, submission diving. Mm-hmm. This was when we're talking about leg locks and things like
diving
that.
For leg locks.
Diving for leg locks. So having that style of where you're going to catch submissions, you might submit some guys, and you might be one of the best guys in the gym if this is your style. The only problem is when you go against guys at a higher level, you will rarely catch them because they're so aware. And your control is not where it needs to be. It's the control that leads to submission. Yeah. We're not catching submissions. Okay. So if you have a catch style game, and not to shit on catch wrestling, but if you have a game where you're catching submissions and you're catching your partners with leg locks and chokes, you might be creating some false positives. And now that's a huge thing where I think when people learn leg locks, it really opens their mind to the idea of the leg lock game being a controlling game leading to submission rather than catching heel hooks and catching leg locks.
Yeah, I like the thought of diving for submissions as being something to be aware of, as something that you shouldn't do. Because when you're diving for submissions, it basically means you're abandoning any pretense of having control and you're rolling the dice. You're hoping to get that submission. And as you mentioned, the problem with diving for submissions is a lot of people can trick themselves into thinking it works. But as you mentioned, against high-level guys, they're usually not going to be fooled by this. And even your training partners, you'll find that a lot of these techniques, they work once or twice, but after a while, as soon as your opponent knows that you're going to do this or they're aware of the defense, they just stop working. I've sparred with guys who do this. They dive for moves, and yeah, they might catch me once, but they're not going to catch me ever again with that. And that's a limitation to that kind of technique, and it's a reason why control is so superior to just basically relying on what is effectively luck. I think one problem is that when you look at a high-level grappler, they move so fast that it looks like they're diving for submissions.
Yeah,
so
right.
if you're not experienced, you look at these guys and you think, well, they're diving for submissions. Why can't I? But once you actually watch the video in slow-mo and break it down, you realize there's a lot of micro positions they're transferring through, and there's a lot of control happening all the way through. Yes, their body is moving, and it might be moving quickly, but they're never giving up control for a percentage chance at a submission.
Exactly right. Like if you're going for a sub, no matter if it's a choke or a joint lock, you always want to have an escape plan. And I don't mean an escape plan like, how am I going to get back to my feet, but more escape plan as if the submission fails, you're still in a dominant position. You still have a dominant angle and you can attack. So if my rear naked choke doesn't work, I still want to be on the back when it's over, or at least have a Kimura control or some strong form of control that will lead me into other opportunities.
Yeah, what you've just described there actually is something that I've personally called committed techniques. And basically, this is a mental model I use to help me make decisions on the fly. And the idea being that, let's say I have a goal in jiu-jitsu. Like, let's say that I want to, I don't know, maybe I want to submit you, right? Let's say I'm in side control and I feel like I've got pretty good positional control. I feel like I've broken your alignment. It's time to go for a submission. If I have a handful of different options, I will always prefer the option that is most likely to allow me to maintain the position or even advance the position versus the option where I run the risk of losing it. A good example is, like, let's say that you're kind of like turtled up and I have the option to do a head and arm choke on you, and I can choose between an anaconda or a Darce choke. I will almost all now granted, actually, disclaimer, I'm bad at both of these chokes, but I will personally almost always prefer the Darce choke, because with the Darce choke, even if the choke fails, there's a good possibility that I'm going to wind up in a better position. If the Darce choke fails, I can still bulldoze the guy over, and now instead of being on his turtle, I might be in side control on top. Whereas with the anaconda choke, because you have to do that gator roll, if it fails, I may have lost that position.
Yeah, you give up your own base going for the gator roll.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I refer to this as the principle or the model of committed techniques. Given multiple options, I will prefer, assuming the result is equally good, personally, I will prefer the option that results in me being able to keep or improve my position versus one where I could lose it.
Yeah, and another example, when we're talking about the Darce choke, if you've ever tried to Darce choke someone with good posture, they're going to be running around like a raging bull and sitting out and moving around. The way to slow them down and immobilize them is by breaking posture. So that involves, collapsing their head inward, bending their spine by bending their neck in. And also, of course, you got to shoot your arm through, which is going to cross their arm, make their arm cross the center line, causing the head and arm choke. So when you break the posture, that's where you're going to actually control a strong opponent, and that way you're not trying to Darce someone who's running around and making your life really hard.
Yeah, that's a good example of it's not as visibly obvious, but it's kind of a form of submission diving where it's like you grab that head and arm and you just squeeze like crazy. But the real advantage to the Darce choke is it's such a powerful position to break the guy's posture on the bottom. And that is really the strength of that move. Even if you fail at the submission, you've gained something worthwhile. It's worth doing even if you don't think you can get the submission.
That's right. And all chokes, whether it's a rear naked choke or a triangle choke, or a bow and arrow choke. The more that I study jiu-jitsu and hone my chokes, the more that I realize that choking is not a squeezing. It's not the squeezing that finishes chokes. Once everything is set in place, the squeezing helps, no doubt, and you can get away with a lot by squeezing hard. But breaking someone's posture into the choke is really what causes a lot of choke. So if I have you in a rear naked choke and my arm is fully sunk, yes, I could finish you by squeezing you, but by breaking your posture, pushing your head forward, using either my hand or my own head, my face, creating a frame on the back of your head and pushing your chin down into the choke is going to amplify the choke a lot. So always think about how are you breaking alignment when you're choking, not necessarily how can I get the tightest squeeze.
This is actually something that I remember seeing in one of Rob's videos, which I thought was a very helpful way to describe choking mechanics. So what he said is that if you want to apply a blood choke, you basically need 3 wedges. You need a wedge on one carotid artery, you need a wedge on the other carotid artery, and you need a wedge behind the neck that pushes down. Like he basically said, think of it like like there's a triangle around your opponent's head, and like the bottom point of the triangle is under the chin. Your goal is to have wedges on all of those sides, and then from the top, you want to push down to make that triangle smaller. So basically, you're creating compression on both of the carotid arteries while additionally breaking posture by pushing down on the head. And if you think about it, every single successful blood choke has this in common, right? And even some air chokes have this in common to some extent, where you're applying pressure laterally on both carotid arteries and most importantly, you're pushing down from the top. So if you're ever having trouble finishing really any type of blood choke, this is a good thing to think about and to use to kind of analyze and troubleshoot your technique.
Yeah, and it's so easy when you're learning chokes to just start squeezing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And every beginner is going to do this. And it really takes a good coach to identify this and to walk them through the proper way to do it. But, if you're going red in the face trying to finish a choke, your mechanics need work. And that is always something to be critical of and to be mindful of and to be to self-reflect when you're doing submissions. Am I using too much strength here? If you are, things probably could be, your dig mechanics could be better. And of course, you could be doing a better job of breaking your opponent's alignment.
Yeah, I would actually say that this goes beyond just applying submissions. But in general, in jiu-jitsu, if you feel you need to develop the mental awareness of what your body is doing, because it is the body's natural response to tighten up and tense up and to try to use strength. And you need to develop the mental awareness of when your body is doing this, because when your body starts tensing up and you're using your strength, it's a signal that you're not doing technique properly. So I try to be aware of this. And if I ever get myself into a position where I realize, man, I'm squeezing really hard here, whether it's a submission or not, it's a way for me to reflect and understand that there's a better way to do what I'm doing and I'm not being efficient. So it's something that I suggest everyone really practice, learning to have that awareness of what your own body is doing and when it's tensing.
Awesome. So should we discuss maybe some joint locks now?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that covers choking mechanics in pretty good depth. So let's talk about joint locks, Matt. What are the principles for joint locks and how do they differ from air chokes and blood chokes?
Well, maybe I just want to cover something. Maybe I misspoke earlier. I said there was 3 kinds of joint locks. I actually I left one out. So we have the linear joint locks, such as an armbar. We have rotational joint locks, such as a kimura. There's also a compression joint lock. So I forgot about this, like say a bicep slicer or a calf slicer.
Or the ultimate submission, the Boston Crab.
Exactly, the sharpshooter.
I believe the sharpshooter is actually a rotational lock, but let's not.
And I believe Ric Flair actually invented the inside Senkaku, although he was very bad at keeping the position because he would always get reversed.
By the way, side note, if anyone out there has figured out how to successfully apply a sharpshooter in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, please let me know, because I have been trying to figure out a way to do that for years. Yeah. Continue.
Okay. So, and of course, there's the like a hybrid joint lock where you combine 2 or more of those types of joint locks. So it's the same sort of thing. And we already discussed lever-based control. So it's important to know, first of all, how to manipulate levers. If we're talking about a linear joint lock, such as an arm bar, we need to establish a proper fulcrum point, and we need to have control of the end of the lever and a strong set of wedges on the other end of the lever. So whether it's going to be an arm bar where we have a strong wedges on the shoulder, and we have a nice fulcrum point underneath the elbow and control on the end of the lever, or if it's a leg lock where we've established a wedge on the hip, a wedge behind the knee, and then control at the end of the on the end of the leg that we're attacking. We're gonna need those elements to create powerful braking pressure. Of course, there's so many details to go through, right? But we'll try and sort of take them as they come. Then there's going to be rotational control. So when we're talking about something like the kimura or the toe hold, what we're looking to generate is something called the ratchet effect. And the ratchet effect is taking a limb and essentially bending it into a 90-degree position where we gain a lot more rotational leverage. An example of this would be, if you have a bunch of screws to screw home and you only have a screwdriver, you're going to be there putting in tons of work with your wrist. It's not going to be very efficient, and you're going to want to bang your head on the wall. Now, if you have a ratchet, something that is like a lever that is sticking out that you can now access, it's going to go by much faster and more efficient. So this is just the exact same concept. When I have a ratchet control over someone's shoulder, I'm going to have a lot more power when it comes to finishing mechanics. I don't want to try and Kimura someone with a straight arm. It doesn't happen, right? It turns into an arm bar or something else. Which
is in itself a legitimate technique, but there's just a different way to finish something like that.
Right. Like I want to maximize the torque that I have on the joint when I'm doing the rotational submissions. So that is going to be how I'm going to gain that, of course. Getting an actual ratchet control means that if it's effective and I have essentially a 2-on-1, my opponent shouldn't be able to break that control, and I'm going to have a lot of finishing power.
Got it. So for the more linear submissions like arm bars, you mentioned that it's critical to apply wedges. I know we talked about this in earlier episodes, but can you maybe elaborate a bit on why those wedges are so important and where you're best positioned to put them?
Right. So, I mean, one of the more common escapes we learn from the armbar as a beginner is the Hitch-Hiker Escape. So why does the Hitch-Hiker Escape work? When we're in the armbar and we try and do the Hitch-Hiker Escape, we turn away from our opponent. If you could do this right now by just putting your arm out, imagining you're in an armbar, and then looking away from the armbar, what happens is your shoulder elevates. So when your shoulder elevates, it actually allows the pressure that would be inside the fulcrum, which is at the elbow, the bridging portion, the pressure is going to bleed from the elbow into the shoulder, which now has mobility. So because the shoulder has mobility, not only can my opponent spin and deke their head underneath the space created by the elevated shoulder, but the pressure that would have otherwise gone into the elbow now bleeds into the shoulder. So this is a big problem when it comes to trying to armbar someone. If we do this and they're allowed to hitchhiker, you're going to get your guard pass unless you act really quick. So it's important to establish a wedge, meaning we're immobilizing the shoulder so that there can't be space underneath the shoulder. If there's space under the shoulder, the pressure won't be isolated within the fulcrum point, and my opponent will be able to spin out, and there will be space underneath for their head to go as they come up and try to pass my guard.
Got it. So if there's something I'm really getting out of the last few conversations we've had on these topics, it's that levers are so critical for establishing positional dominance, right? When you're advancing your position, it's basically all a lever battle, really. Finishes are all about wedges, it sounds like. Like, regardless of whether you're doing a choke or you're doing a joint lock, it's ultimately the wedges that dictate the power. I mean, with to some extent lever control as well, but ultimately it's the wedges that are going to determine whether your submission works or it doesn't. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you're just imagine any submission, try to apply any submission on someone who can move. Mm-hmm. It doesn't happen. It's really not possible. You really need to isolate and immobilize if you're going to get finishing mechanics. And that really applies for almost any submission I can think of.
I can't think of any submission that does not require this principle.
Even a flying armbar, a submission that's in motion, it only works because you have correct wedges around your opponent. So if you don't have those wedges...
It's hilarious if you don't have those wedges.
You land right on your head, and that's why people don't do flying armbars. A lot of people don't do flying arm bars.
Or they do them once.
Yeah, and then they get concussed. So of course, linear submissions, you're just hyperextending and looking to create wedges on the end of the lever. And one thing that really helped me, like a detail that Rob showed me that was just wicked, is when you're doing the arm bar. I didn't even think of this, okay? Like, when you pull the end of the lever down, so you've got the double wrist control and your legs are tight, everything's looking good. Instead of trying to pull the arm open and pull the hand down into your chest, what he showed me is actually pull the hand towards your head. So you pull the arm away from the body. And if you can imagine what this does, it basically takes the slack out of the joint. And this is huge. You can get so much pressure thinking about taking the slack out of the joint by pulling the hand away from the body. And this is the exact same thing that we do with a lot of our heel hooks.
Yeah, it's, this actually ties into the concept of limb coiling, which we talked about earlier. If you allow your opponent to position their limbs and in this, basically retract their knees and their elbows and their neck, it gets a lot harder to submit them. And if you're just trying to yank on the guy's arm, you're going to have problems breaking their posture and their structure. What you really want to do is you want to isolate those limbs. You want to extract that limb from the body. So to your point, if you're trying to like pull on the guy's arm while that elbow is still tucked in as close to the body, you're very unlikely to get that submission. What I found has been very helpful in dealing with arm bars, for example, if my opponent is clasping his hands together really tight, is adding a degree of rotational control. So rather than trying to pull straight back, I actually fall onto my side towards his head while grabbing onto his arm tightly. And the important pointer is I don't grab onto his arm and pull it. I pull myself very closely and tightly around his arm so that my chest is basically on his arm. And then I'm pulling with my core, not with my arms. The only purpose of my arms is to glue his arm to my core. It's my core that's doing the pulling and not my arms.
And same with the finishing mechanics, just like you say, you use your body. I mean, when you're bridging, of course you have to have strong wedges, but it's your hips and your essentially your posture that's creating the submission. And like you said, your arms are just controlling the lever, not necessarily doing the majority. You would never be in an armbar lying back and there's a giant space between your body and your opponent's hand, and then you're making a big movement pulling the hand towards your body. You would sit up, connect, and then use your body to finish. And of course, it is especially things like knee bars. If you think about knee bars, you're trying to finish a knee bar. We think so much about how we have to lean back, right? We grab the end of the leg and we lean back. It has so much more to do with what your legs are doing on your opponent's hip and thigh that is going to dictate how strong your knee bar is and whether or not they're going to be able to move. Because when you try and just lean back, that movement of leaning back is what Danaher calls the follow-through room, right? Mm-hmm. And that should be the last thing you do, really.
That's the exclamation point at the end of the sentence. Yeah. You should already have enough finishing power by that point.
That's right. Those are your major finishing mechanics, right? The minor finishing mechanics are, how did you get there? How did you get your wedges in place? How are you, how are you going to hyperextend that arm, like break their grips and whatnot? And really make your wedges strong enough that you can apply the pressure. The hipping in really shouldn't need a ton of follow-through room if you're doing the submission properly.
Yeah, there are big advantages to the leaning back, and a lot of people do this in particularly in arm bars, in leg locks, and in guillotine chokes. I see this a lot where they grab onto the limb or the neck and they lean back like crazy, In addition to the problems you already described with that, Matt, another problem with leaning back is that number one, it disengages your core, which means that you're no longer using your core muscles to apply pressure. If you recall from earlier episodes, we talked about how when you're applying a submission, you want to use overwhelming force. You want to use every part of your body, especially your core, to engage. And that's even in submissions where it may not be obvious. Like when you're guillotine choking a guy, the power actually comes from your core. You want to like compress and squeeze into the guy and tighten up. That's how you finish a guillotine. It's not by grabbing onto his head and leaning back as far as you can.
That's how you take the wedge off the back of his head and his head pops out.
Yeah, and the other problem too with leaning back, if you recall again from earlier episodes, we talked about the power of limb coiling, keeping your body tight like a ball. It's kind of like a spring, right? When you got a spring and you compress it really, really small, there's a lot of potential energy there that can explode at any time. The way I like to think of it is like a snake. Like a snake it coils itself when it's ready to strike, and it can move fast. It doesn't like lie down flat on the ground because then it can't do anything. It coils because it's loaded like a spring and it can generate force. If you don't load like a spring like that, it impacts your ability to use your core to generate force. Additionally, if your limbs aren't coiled, it gives your opponent a way to break your structure, right? Like when I lean back, my elbows and my knees are no longer connected to my tummy, right? I've opened myself up, and that gives my opponent the ability to start isolating things and escaping as well. So not only does it kill the pressure to do that lean back, but it also makes it easier for your opponent to escape because now they can start like messing with your arms and your legs.
Right.
You see this a lot. Like a perfect example is a leg lock. If you dive for a leg lock on me and instead of applying proper control, you just lean back like crazy, what you've effectively done, number one, you're not using any actual braking power. But number two, you've cut your own body in half. Now your two legs are right in front of me and the rest of your body is not engaged. So I can start attacking your legs and I may even be able to finish you from there, right? So it is so important to stay coiled and stay tight all the time, especially when you're doing a submission where a lot of people, the kind of the common reaction is to lean back. You really never want to do that.
Yeah, and this might not be so much of a finishing detail, but strategically, when I'm going for a submission, let's say it's an arm bar, or let's say it's a like a heel hook from the 411, the control leading to that, I want to control the free leg or the free arm. So, like I said, this isn't really a finishing detail, but when I'm in the armbar position, like I
actually think it is. I've realized recently, I think it is a finishing detail.
It helps break the grips for sure, right? Like if someone's in the armbar, I have my arm wrapped around the arm that I want to attack. My legs are strong wedges around whatever portion of my opponent's upper body that I can. Collecting the far arm and pulling it tight, essentially making your opponent be in a straitjacket position, really reduces their alignment. So now they're crushed inside this box and they can't move side to side. So withdrawing their arm is very difficult. This is just a stronger example of wedging. And when I'm in the 411, if I don't control the free leg with my arms, my opponent is going to be able to spin and move and get into base and do all these things, whereas I can isolate them inside the inside senkaku by controlling the free leg with my arm, and then my legs are wedging around the leg that I want to attack.
This is a callback to the last episode we did on dominant angles, where we talked about how, hey, it's great to arm drag someone, it's great to leg drag someone, but it's not just about controlling the lever that you're grabbing onto. It's about applying a wedge on the other side as well. And it's the same with like an arm bar, right? It's wonderful if I can grab someone's arm and I can attack it. But if I cannot put some sort of wedge on the far side, then they can just extract that lever. I've found the same principle to be true recently, as you mentioned, where when you're arm barring someone, I find these days for me, to have success, it's less about what I do to the arm I'm grabbing and more about controlling the far arm and making sure, because if I can put a wedge behind their far arm, they can't move. Whereas if I'm just grabbing their near arm, they might be able to bridge, they can extract the arm. And it's the same thing with leg locks, right? If I dive into like standard ashi and I've got standard ashi on someone, I can be doing everything right. But the fact that that far leg is still free allows my opponent a lot of mobility, and he can do a lot to compensate for the fact that I'm controlling that one leg. But as soon as you grab that other leg and especially if you can start wedging in that other leg, now Uki can't move. And that completely changes the situation, right? It means that I actually have full control over the position rather than partial control. I'm starting to think it's so important that when you control one lever, you've got to be controlling something on the opposite side. I mean, I don't know if that's universal, but it's a pattern I've seen a lot in my recent training sessions.
It's definitely manifesting a lot for me. I'm finding that if I'm just going to attack one limb and I get a submission, I either someone I'm going against, either maybe not the highest level, or I just caught a submission, and I'd rather have a submission. I'd rather be able to do a submission slow. So that I know that I have full control. And that is something that that I try and do when I'm training, is I try and do things slow. And, there is a time when you're practicing for competition that you got to dial things up and go faster. But if you can do things slow, you can do them fast generally. Yeah. And it demonstrates a deeper understanding of control, which is, I think, more important. So maybe we should go on and talk about some rotational submissions.
Yeah, let's talk about that. This is something that, from my experience, I found actually that rotational control is powerful even in the context of linear submissions, right? There are very few linear submissions like an armbar or a knee bar that you cannot actually improve upon by adding a little bit of rotational control too. But then there are submissions that are completely rotational, like the probably the most obvious example being a Kimura, right?
Kimura or heel hook or toe hold. These moves are all moves. If you'll notice, like I used to think of these moves as a 2-on-1, usually creating like a figure four, right? Like a Kimura is going to be a figure four. But also, these moves involve your legs being involved as well. So whether your legs are going to be isolating that shoulder that you're attacking in the Kimura, wrapping your legs around your opponent, or if you're basing on the ground off those legs when you're on top position finishing the Kimura, or if you're in the 411 or an outside Ashi finishing a heel hook, your legs also need to create wedges or get into base as well. But essentially it's a, you want to create as much torque as you can. So let's maybe just talk in terms of a Kimura for now. I'd like to create an open elbow by pulling my opponent's elbow away from their body. Doing this creates so much more control because as we discussed earlier, anytime my opponent's elbow leaves their body, they become exposed with the open elbow. And definitely check out Ryan Hall's open elbow series. It's amazing. So when I'm doing the Kimura, I'm not just focused on how am I going to put the guy's hand behind his head. In fact, if I focus on just pulling his hand behind his head, he's actually going to posture up and rip his arm up. Yeah. What I need to do is create a wedge behind his shoulder. But usually, if I have the Kimura locked up, the arm that's going around the back through the armpit needs to be tight to my body. Mm-hmm. What that's going to do is create a wedge on their shoulder, and it's going to improve my structure with that elbow by pinning it to my ribs.
And it allows you to engage your core, right? Otherwise, you're just pulling with your arms, and that is not strong. And this is why most people fail on the Kimura. As soon as you pull your hands in and wrap your own core around Uki's arm, now you can engage your core.
Great point. Like you don't want to do these moves with your limbs, guys. I mean, even though it looks like it, and essentially, yes, you are using your limbs to create control, it's your body that does the majority of the horsepower. And that's always important to think about. So now if I have the Kimura and I have the arm, I'm pulling my elbow to my body, and now I can start pulling their elbow away from their body using like a shrugging type movement. I'm going to create distance between their elbow and their body and get way more control. And I'm going to be able to now bring the hand close to the head. It's not just like, if anyone out there plays the Kimura system, like the Kimura trap that leads to the back and whatnot, you'll know that you have to create that wedge on the end of the lever, which is the shoulder, as well as have the wrist, the 2-on-1 on the wrist, right? And another thing when you're doing the Kimura is you can always find extra leverage using your wrists. So if you think about your arms, they're levers to your shoulder, right? But your hand is also a lever. So what I use commonly when I'm using the Kimura control is I use the quote monkey grip, where I take my thumbs out of the equation. I'm no longer grabbing my opponent's wrist with the C grip, but I take my thumb out, and now I have like essentially 2 monkey grips, one on my opponent's wrist, one on my own. If I have this position and I roll my wrists down as if I'm revving down a motorcycle, I get tremendous torque on the shoulder. And this is kind of a hidden gem in the Kimura system. If you don't do this, if you do the Kimura grabbing just the wrist,
you're using your wrists as a wedge almost against his hand, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like I do use the C grip to isolate my opponent's wrist. But when I go to finish and when I really want to apply Kimura control, I switch to the no thumb grip. And that allows me to use my wrists as to torque up the Kimura a lot more. I get a lot more rotation that way, and it's actually really shocking how much more power you get. So if you don't play with that, definitely try that next time you get a Kimura. Roll your wrists forward, and yeah, just a lot of the time, as well as I will be extending my arms rather than trying to pull my arms close to my body when I have the Kimura control.
Got it. So, something maybe you could elaborate on that I thought was really interesting. You said that when you're playing the Kimura game, you can always create more pressure by putting a wedge against your opponent's shoulder. Can you maybe talk a little bit more about what you meant by that?
So yeah, like if I'm in a crucifix position and I have the Kimura control around the back, like the T shape with my opponent, if the arm that's over in front of my opponent's chest is open, that's going to actually leave a lever that my opponent can exploit. And essentially, once they push that lever, my Kimura will start to fall apart.
And when you say open, you mean like your elbow is exposed? Is that what you're talking about?
That's right. If they can create space between my elbow and their shoulder. So, I mean, it is a little bit hard to illustrate through audio, but when you have the Kimura control, you should have the arm that's grabbing your opponent's wrist. That same elbow should be tight, tethered to their shoulder. Like
pinched into his armpit?
Sometimes when I finish the Kimura, yes, but more so just connected, and there's no space underneath that can be exploited.
Got it.
I mean, you really do have to spend some time under someone who knows the Kimura trap to to have all the details and to have all the control. But essentially what you need is you need that 2-on-1. You need to control the end of the lever. You need to have the other arm coming underneath and threading through into your and connecting with your own hand. And you need to have the arm that's this is getting confusing. You need to have your arm that's grabbing your opponent's wrist applied as a wedge against your opponent's shoulder to immobilize their shoulder.
It actually makes quite a bit of sense. I think that, I mean, I know it does get tricky to describe this in words, but I think I actually understand quite clearly what you're saying. So what you're saying is like, hey, when you got the Kimura, it's not just about having a figure 4 on his arm. You're basically trying to pull that arm away from his body. You don't want his arm connected to his body. You want it to be out floating around freely, and you are using your own arms, probably particularly your elbows, as a wedge so that he can't pull that arm back, right? You want that arm to be as far away from his body as possible.
That's right. And if you look in positions like a top side Kimura, when I Kimura my opponent, what the shoulder naturally wants to do, just like we discussed in the armbar earlier, is it wants to rise to alleviate the pressure that's on the shoulder. So if I can apply pressure on top of the shoulder, it's just like what we discussed with the armbar earlier, immobilizing the shoulder that will have a dramatic effect on the pressure being applied to the joint, and the pressure will now no longer be able to bleed out when the shoulder gets elevated.
Got it. Yeah, and thank you for this, because this is something that you actually taught me a few years ago, which I really appreciate. When I used to try to apply the Kimura, like a lot of people, I'd get the figure 4 grip and I'd start trying to turn his arm behind his shoulder, and it's like, well, I can't do it. And it was only when you showed me that I realized the figure 4 grip is great, but that's just the first step. You then have to isolate his arm. You have to pull it away from his body.
That's right.
This in itself is actually a mental model, which is that you always want to isolate your targets. You never want to try to attack a guy's limb while it is strong and connected to his body or to another limb. You always want to have his limbs free floating to the greatest extent possible, right? Your opponent's limbs are weak when they're not able to connect to anything else. So this is a true principle in basically any submission, and even in a lot of positional improvements as well. If you can pull your opponent's limbs away from the core, this is like the opposite of limb coiling, which we talked about earlier. You want to put your limbs close to your core. You want to prevent your opponent from doing that. And it is always beneficial if you can pull your opponent's limbs very far away from the rest of his body.
Mm-hmm. And the Kimura is such a strong tool to use. Definitely, if if you don't use the Kimura as a system and not just a submission, you're denying yourself of one of the main control schemes in the no-gi system. I mean, it leads to the back, it leads to guard passing. It is such an all-purpose tool. You definitely have to start incorporating the Kimura as a submission.
You know, the Kimura is a great example of what we've talked about a little bit earlier, which is that there really is no such thing as a submission. Like, a submission is just a particular type of position where you have employed enough breakage of alignment that your opponent has to give up. Almost any submission can be thought of as a position and can be used for positional advancement. The Kimura is a very obvious situation, because even if you can't finish the Kimura, you can use the Kimura to get from like bottom guard all the way to your opponent's back just by applying leverage. But it's not just the Kimura. You can do that with arm bars. You can do that with triangles. I do that with omoplatas a lot, where I use omoplatas not so much hey, I'll finish the guy if I can, but really what I'm doing is I'm using that leverage for positional advancement. And it's so important to think of submissions as just a particular type of position that you can flow into and out of.
Yeah, and just because you have a figure 4 grip on your opponent's arm doesn't mean you have broken their alignment.
Yeah.
So that's, aesthetically it looks like a Kimura, but this is another one of those position versus alignment situations that we talked about before.
Yeah.
And I guess the last type of joint lock to talk about would be a compression. And this should be quick. There's not a lot of compression joint locks out of there. There is, of course, the slicers. There's the bicep slicer and the calf slicer. My 2 cents on these moves, we all know about the calf slicer when my opponent is facing away from me and they're essentially trying to scramble to get away, and I've locked my legs and I'm coming up almost like I'm about to take their back and they're in the sprinter's stance. So I'll tell you why I don't like this type of a slicer, and then I'll tell you what type of slicer I do like and why I like that one better. So here goes. If I have a calf slicer on someone and they turn away and they're in the sprinter's escape, and I'm trying to cling to their back, almost like a backpack, and I've got their leg folded up. I think you know what I'm talking about. This type of move, I've seen 2 people hurt their knees very badly trying to apply this move. And here's why. When you're trying to apply this move, your knee is essentially flared out in an unnatural position.
You've broken your own alignment to apply the submission.
Yeah, like the strong point of this submission, if you imagine coming up on top of someone's back and you've got them in the slicer, your knee, your shin is essentially horizontal. It's sideways. So when you hip into that, you're putting all that pressure into the outside of your knee, okay? And that's a really good way to hurt your knee. I've seen guys go for this submission. One guy in particular, one of my close training partners, 260 pounds, he applied this to a 150-pounder, a small man. And the guy, what did the guy do?
Spun, broke his leg.
He didn't spin, although that is dangerous too. But all he did was he was in stance because he was in a sprinter stance. So he's in alignment. He had base and he kicked his leg straight. So the combination of my friend applying this slicer sideways to his knee and the other guy being in base and being able to just kick his leg straight caused this guy to pop his knee. So the guy who was attacking actually got hurt. And I've seen this happen twice. The reason I don't like this type of a submission is because you're applying it to someone who's in base. So that's really going to be, in the hierarchy of things, we always try and break alignment. I would never try and berimbolo someone who's, his butt's not on the ground. I might be able to spin underneath them, but it's going to be really hard to actually land a berimbolo on someone with base, just like it's really hard to heel hook someone with base. Now, a slicer that I like is one from the truck. So if I have my opponent in the truck and I'm able to isolate the leg that I'm entangling and I can apply a slicer in that fashion, I find that effective and quite safe. Why?
Your opponent's not in base.
My opponent's not in base. They're on their back. Their feet are up in the air. They cannot drive and create powerful, explosive movements. So I can totally see that one working, whereas the other one is I steer clear of that. I mean, there's really no reason to do that when I can just abandon it and try and get to my opponent's back from that position.
Yeah, and that's a good example of what you talked about earlier, where, there's a difference between having a submission and being in a position that looks like a submission. If you don't actually have the guy's alignment broken, you're not in a submission. A good example there, like you said, is where you've technically got a slicer in terms of, your body is positioned in a way that it looks like a slicer, but if your opponent is on top of you and has their base, they're actually the ones with the power in that situation. So,
and they're mobile.
Yeah, and they're mobile. So you're actually the one who might be in more danger. I generally find that, in moves like this, if your elbows or your knees are flared out at an awkward angle, you're probably not in a position of power, regardless of what's going on. I try to always avoid situations where my elbows or my knees are flared out, because you're effectively breaking your own structure when you do that. Number one, you have no power. And number two, if your opponent moves the wrong way, they can put tremendous pressure on your joints and cause breaking damage to you. So that's kind of something to always be cognizant of, is just make sure that even if you think you're on the offensive, make sure your elbows and your knees are never flared out at awkward angles.
Yep, and when we talk about like risk versus reward, generally I never go for submissions that put me at risk. It's just there's no point for me to go for that submission when I can now transition to my opponent's back and create some really good opportunities for finishing.
Got it. So just to kind of recap, we talked about a lot of mental models today. The big topic today was finishing mechanics. We can break those down into 2 main categories. You've got choking mechanics and you've got breaking mechanics, which are for joints. When it comes to choking mechanics, really the best way to think of blood chokes in particular is to kind of imagine a triangle around your opponent's head. You want to wedge in all directions there, on all sides of the triangle. You want to have wedges on both carotid arteries, and the power you get comes from pushing the wedge down on the back of the neck. That also breaks the posture, which is a critical mistake that a lot of people make when they're applying a submission, especially a choke, is they don't break their opponent's posture, and then they're surprised that the submission doesn't work. When we talk about breaking mechanics, Matt, I believe you said you kind of broke these down into 3 different types of locks. You've got linear, like the standard armbar. You've got rotational, like the Kimura. and you've got compression locks like a slicer, right? And the specific rules for these vary, but generally what you want to do is you want to have, you probably have a lever that you're attacking in most cases. And one of the ways that you control that lever is through the systematic application of wedges to isolate that lever and to apply pressure to that lever. So other related mental models we talked about here, we talked about the principle of committed techniques, the idea being that if you've got multiple options available that all yield the same result, you probably want to favor the option that is going to put you in a better position at the end of the day, right? Rather than a sacrifice option where you could lose the position if something doesn't go the way that you expect. We talked about rotational control, and a subset of that being the Ratchet Effect. So the idea being that you can almost always create power by adding rotation, which is going to further break structure. The way that most people think about this is in the context of a Kimura, but even with an arm bar or a knee bar, or even with like a guillotine choke, you can apply significantly more power if you add a little bit of rotation to it. We talked about overwhelming force, something we talked about earlier, which is that we want to not just pull with our arms and legs, but we want to use all of our weapons, particularly our core when we attack a submission. We talked about limb coiling again. So the idea that we want to keep our elbows, knees, and our neck tight. We want to be like a dead spider. We don't want to let our opponent pull any of our limbs free. And then on the converse of that, we talked about how when you want to finish your opponent, that's what you want to do to them. You want to isolate a single target. You don't want to try to finish a submission on a limb that is still tight to your opponent's core. You need to focus on pulling that limb free and isolating it, and then systematically applying wedges so that your opponent cannot get that limb back. And so that when you apply pressure to that limb, the opponent has nowhere to go, and the pressure cannot bleed to a different joint.
That's right. And if it fails, that you can recover to hopefully a position of equal or better value.
Exactly. So, I mean, that's a pretty in-depth discussion. I think, Matt, maybe we could do some questions.
Sure. It's letter time.
So one thing that came up that someone mentioned, they wanted to talk a little bit about hygiene. This is a big topic. It's actually probably a series of topics, but it's something that is always a sensitive point in jiu-jitsu. And that is basically what should you do in jiu-jitsu to have good hygiene? What are the expectations on a training partner in terms of hygiene? And Matt, as a gym owner, I'm sure you have thoughts on this.
Yes, we've all encountered people that are just, either they come into the gym, most people are fine, but some people come into the gym after work, or they just, they were never really taught the proper ways to carry themselves in public or in a setting where we're actually lying on top of each other, choking each other out. So one of the ways I like to look at it is go to jiu-jitsu almost as if you're going to a date, meaning that you are clean, your nails are trimmed, there's no odors or anything, and of course your uniform, whether it's gi or no gi, is clean. That is one of the biggest things. You have to wash your gi, and it has to be every class. If you think that your gi is not dirty enough to merit washing for the next class, wash it anyways. Another thing is the whole don't wash your belt thing. If you believe that, you are an idiot. I'm not saying wash your belt every class, because I don't do that. But I do wash my belt maybe once a week, or at least once every 2 weeks, because your belt is a piece of cloth, just like anything. It's going to carry bacteria.
Yeah, I wash my belt every class. I am not one of the believers that my belt has some sort of magical power in it that gives me skill. It's just a cheap piece of fabric. It was imported, I think, from Pakistan. I really could not care less about my belt. It can go in the wash. Hey, it might shrink a bit, but honestly, this should be a big factor of how you buy your gi. So what I like to do is I buy gis with a bit of room, knowing they're probably going to shrink, because I wash and dry the heck out of my gis. I want them to be super clean. Another thing to understand is that just because you put your gi through the wash, that doesn't mean it's actually as clean as it should be. A lot of people always bring this up with me, and they say, man, I wash my gi every class, but after a month or two, it still winds up smelling. The reason why that is the case is because bacteria is very, very persistent. My suggestion here is that once in a while, you should wash your gi with an antimicrobial agent. This is a fancy way of saying something that breaks down basically breaks down bacteria so that it can't survive. Cheapest way to do this is to buy some vinegar and put a little bit of it in your wash when you do your laundry. You don't need to buy some big fancy expensive antimicrobial agent. Just use a bit of vinegar. And my first concern when I heard about this was, is this going to make you smell like fish and chips? The answer is no, it actually doesn't make you smell like fish and chips. And believe it or not, this is not an old wives' tale. I looked, when people kept telling me at the beginning, wash your gi with vinegar, I thought this was some crazy folk wisdom that couldn't be true, but it turns out it actually is. Vinegar has antimicrobial properties which break down bacteria. And because it's really, really cheap and it doesn't have any dye in it, it's a really good candidate for something that you can throw in your laundry if you're doing an activity like jiu-jitsu, because it really makes a difference and is going to prevent that problem where after a few months your gi starts to smell regardless of how many times you wash it.
Yeah, great points. And of course, try and shower beforehand if you can. Definitely after, which will prevent... limit. We won't say prevent because there accidents do happen, but it'll limit staph infections and ringworm. And of course, if you do have any weird spots on your body, get them checked out as soon as possible, especially if they look like a circle, which is definitely going to be something like ringworm. Beginners, I notice, tend to not be so sure about what that is. They might not even have ever heard of ringworm or staph infections. It's important that beginners know that if they have any weird spots or rashes or, God forbid, oozing, pussing sores, you've got to get that checked out because that is highly contagious and you can't be bringing that in the mat. And if it means you got to sit out a week or two or more, you have to. Yeah,
this is something that cannot be driven home hard enough. This is deeply important and everyone needs to understand this. This is literally a life and death matter. A lot of people, especially newbies who don't really understand combat sports, they try to tough it out. Like they see something weird on their body and they think, if it becomes a big deal, I'll go to the doctor. That is not what you need to do. You need to go to the doctor right away if after grappling you see something weird up on your body, even if it just looks like a rash that you can't explain or that wasn't there before. The reason this is particularly important is because, first of all, in a grappling context, these things are going to be incredibly contagious, right? You're touching people very directly. There's fluid exchange. These things are going to transfer from one person to another. But additionally, you can die from this stuff, and you can die very fast. Staph, in particular, MRSA, the medically resistant variant of staph, is deadly, and it can kill you within a matter of hours, right? Like there are stories of people who have had staph, and at first it doesn't look like anything, and then 8 hours later, like half of their limb has been eaten, and they're in a life and death situation in the hospital. Also, bear in mind that jiu-jitsu is very popular amongst medical professionals like paramedics, EMTs, doctors, police officers. These are people who work with people in high-risk settings. So when you transfer something gnarly to them, you are putting people with compromised immune systems at risk because they could be passing that on to the people they train with. So if you have something like that, even if it's just a weird mark that you can't explain, always get it looked at. This is not just a matter of being nice to your training partners. This is literally a life and death situation.
And you must always think about this as it's not a shameful thing. Mm-hmm. Some people are too embarrassed to come forward and tell their instructor. And so what they do is they cover up and they think they can keep training because they're deeply embarrassed. Guys, it's not embarrassing to get staph or ringworm. Be honest with your instructor. Tell them what's going on and say, I need to take some time off. Mm-hmm. If your instructor is reasonable and understanding, hopefully they'll pause your membership and you won't lose any time and you can come back when you're healed. But you cannot be running anyone the risk because what is shameful and embarrassing is actually getting caught training with it. People will remember that. And that is something you don't want to live with. And like Steve said, it's life or death.
Yeah, absolutely. Staph and other transmittable diseases like this are not a joke. They need to be taken very, very seriously on the mats. And additionally, as Matt said, if you do realize you have staph, you owe it to your team to tell them. You should tell your instructor so that they can relay that to members of the team so that they know that they've been exposed. This is also important for other diseases. If, for example, you get exposed to something like mumps, or some other weird disease, make sure that your instructor knows so that they can tell everyone else on their team. This is critical critical because some of the people that you train with might spend a lot of their time working with the elderly or children or people in the hospital. If these people are in contact with people who have compromised immune systems, it's very important that they know if they've been exposed to something so that they can take preventative action right away.
Yeah, and the best way to deal with this is to always shower right after class, if possible. Don't go home and marinate on the couch for 3 hours and then, I'm going to go in, or I'll shower the next day is one of the scariest things ever, okay?
Shower immediately.
Shower immediately. Try to use an antibacterial like soap if you can. Like I use Head and Shoulders. It usually kills everything. Another great thing to just mention real quick is if you're going to a gym and you're brand new, just assume that every time you step off the mats, you need footwear. Yeah. So whether that's going to be sandals or whatever, especially in the washroom, don't be walking around barefoot. You will get called on it. A lot of gyms have signs or whatever, but some don't. So definitely try and have footwear off the mats, and you do not want to be transferring bacteria onto the mats where people's faces are going to be smushed against.
Yeah, you brought up a good point. We talked about disinfecting your clothing with an antimicrobial agent. You also want to disinfect yourself. You can get antimicrobial soap and shampoo. I believe Head and Shoulders has antimicrobial properties. I think that's how it kills dandruff, but I'm not totally sure on that. So I'd suggest you look it up before you believe me on this. Yeah. But I that's what, you can wash with antimicrobial soap and shampoo, and that's always a good idea as well. I'd highly recommend it.
Just imagine you're trying to impress a really hot date and you're going to show them how clean you're going to be. That's what you want to do when you go into the jiu-jitsu school is you want to make sure that no one has problems with the way that you smell or, any other issues like that could lead to serious infections.
Yeah. And on one other thing on the topic of hygiene, although it is not technically illegal to do in jiu-jitsu, I do not suggest farting on your opponent's face as an escape or submission. I understand it is devastating. I have had it happen to me. I suggest you try to avoid that if you possibly can.
Yeah, accidents do happen.
Okay, well, I think that's a pretty comprehensive discussion. Thanks again, Matt. Thanks to everyone listening. And we will talk to you next time.
All right. Thanks, guys.